So weird for five. I think BlackRock is using Disney as a shell company with Epic. They might have their own proxy war with Tencent. Thoughts? I don't know about all that. I think, look, people put a lot of weight into the whole BlackRock thing, and I get it. But, you know, we've got to try to delineate between, you know, what is kind of really going on versus we don't want to get too far down the mass conspiracy theory side of things. But I get why people...
You also don't need to actually purchase and acquire. You don't need to make the acquisition if you can create a culture where your ideologies become pervasive. So BlackRock is helping to sell this ideology, and they successfully market that ideology to Disney. You don't need to actually own them. They're just going to be acting consistently with what you want anyway. So.
Right. That's it. And it's not just them. I mean, you can throw in a lot of the major banking institutions, a lot of other fund companies over the years, a lot of other investments or investors, I should say, that have pushed this same ideology. They're not the only one. They're not just the end all be all.
You're the right guy for me to ask this. I actually read that when the bailouts came, that was like the birthplace of DEI. That what the left basically argued for was, okay, they claimed that was the conservatives who wanted the bailouts, even though I was screaming against the bailouts then to anyone who listened to me.
As was I.
A much smaller audience, and saying, look, if you die, you die. And I don't care whether you're an American institution like GM, if you die, and for the banks also, whether you're Wells Fargo or whomever, if you die, if you screw up, that's how companies learn not to really over risk. Otherwise, they're always going to over risk. If the government's there to act as a safety net, it's kind of ridiculous.
Sears had really bad timing, Joe. Sears just, if they could have held on for a few more years to get on this too big to fail thing.
Yeah. So, but my point, but what I read somewhere, and I really never got to talk to anyone that I know and respect who's familiar with the financial end of things the way you might be, Valiant, is that the left basically started arguing, okay, fine, if we're going to sign off on this, that part of these bailouts, that some of the pork thrown in there are motivations for banks to basically recompense or give favorable terms to companies that are going to engage in DEI. And that was the birthplace of there being all these different rating scales for companies that are, you know, do well with their, it was actually with their governance. What was it? It's governance. It's
ESG.
ESG. Yeah. That's the birthplace of ESG.
Environmental social governance. Yeah.
Yeah. The birthplace of ESG was from those bailouts. And that led to what we see here with the DEI. So it's basically, if you're more conscientious about the climate, if you're more conscientious about racial matters or things of that nature, in that case, you get more favorable terms dealing with banks, and that banks were sort of obliged to work within that framework. Is that something that you can confirm as being the timing and really the genesis of this entire backward culture that we're facing today?
I don't know if it was really the genesis of it, but it certainly was a big step forward. I mean, I think there was this idea out there that, you know, I think what was some of the terminology used, like corporatism kind of thing, where, you know, this new movement where, well, you know, the government doesn't have to take over industry, right? It can just simply regulate its will into it and still say, well, we still have a free market system. Well, but when you really look at it, is it really? Right?
Is it?
Yeah, because if you want to be able to play the game, you have to do what the people who regulate you want you to do. And yeah, I could probably do a couple hours on that whole story, because I mean it's a very complicated mess. But to kind of boil it down, it's one of those classic stories of I still love Ronald Reagan's great quote. The scariest thing ever said was, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," and that's exactly what happened that put us in the situation in 2008 to begin with. Was a lot of regulation that told the big banks and all the banks, the lenders, commercial lenders, that you need to start lending more money to people that maybe not necessarily can pay it back. But don't worry. What we're going to do is we're going to set up Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac through other private partners like Countrywide that would then fetter it out. AIG, of course, was involved. We're going to make sure that, you know, when you sell those higher risk mortgages, that you're going to be able to immediately turn around and just sell them off. I mean, you remember back in the old days when you went and got a loan from a bank to buy a house, Well, that bank was traditionally servicing that mortgage for the length of the loan, right? 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. It got to the point then where people were just selling the mortgages, placing the business, and then if it didn't meet, certain risk criteria, they could then turn around and sell that mortgage off to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Well, you had a guy named Franklin Raines at the time who was in charge of, I think he was in charge of Freddie Mac. Or it might have been Fannie Mae. I can't remember which one. But he was in charge of one of those. Guess what? His compensation was tied to during that period in the late 90s and early 2000s. His compensation, his bonuses were largely tied to how many of these high-risk loans were bought up by the company, which was a federally owned corporation mortgage company, that would be able to serve, traditionally, quote unquote, underprivileged communities that otherwise would never have gotten these loans because of the financial risk factor. Had nothing to do with race or skin color or anything else. It's like, well, you have no income, you have no assets. How are we going to collateralize this loan apart from the house itself and actually secure the fact that you're going to be able to make these payments every month? Well, don't worry, the federal government was going to take care of that for you. And then eventually there were warning signs for years, and eventually we got to 2008. And the rug was pulled out from under it, and everybody screamed that Wall Street did it. Well, that's kind of true, but the fact of the matter is no private lending institution, no bank in Wall Street would ever have engaged in these activities but for the fact that the federal government created a deliberate system to force it to happen. Because guess what? If you didn't want to play ball, if you didn't want to have so many of your loans, a certain percentage of your loans hit that, low income or low asset type of demographic, then you might just find yourself in front of federal regulators more often than you'd like. So, but guess who put all that together? It was two guys named Chris Dodd and Barney Frank.
Dodd for
I gotta miss those days now, Valiant. Now we're into the. Go ahead.
I was going to say, guess who got to write the legislation after the 2008 financial collapse to fix it all?
Yeah,
Chris Dodd and Barney Frank.
I know about that. But I miss those days because, and I'm totally not political, but yeah, it's dangerous, I think, now that we live in a world where folks can be fined the GDP of some countries for crimes that feature no victims, and therefore the compensation doesn't go to a victim, it goes to the state. Yeah. So I miss the days of yore, despite those things.
Indeed, indeed. All right, let me grab these.
Would never happen, Pro. That would never ever happen.
No,
I'm a dystopian conspiracy theorist. I tell you.
Yes.
Inside a lot of that. No. Inside a lot of that kind of legislation. The point of all that is inside a lot of that kind of legislation that basically was deliberately written to destroy the mid-tier and small-level banks, right? All the little local banks, the community banks. Why do you think a lot of them went out of business or they sold off to the larger banks? They did not have the financial capacity to comply with all these new federal regulations, which were in large part written by, guess who? J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, all the other Goldman Sachs, all the other big banks out there. They basically helped write the legislation with Dodd and Frank to put all of their small local competitors out of business or force them to sell to the bigger ones who could actually comply financially with the new regs. And in all that, yes, there was a lot of things like some of the ESG stuff came along with that, and then later that tied into it, that we wanted you to have so many loans or so much of your portfolio had to be with companies that met these new social scores, that were very, very ambiguous.
Korean?
Yes. Well, so you get the idea there. So make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.